Hello students, my name is Jyoti Sharan and I am your biology teacher. Today we are going to start a new chapter in biology, that is chapter 17. That is now your first chapter in human biology. Before, the first chapter in human biology was digestion and absorption, but according to the new syllabus the digestion and absorption part has been deleted. So in this particular syllabus we have to cover our breathing and exchange of gases as our first chapter in biology as human physiology. Okay, so in this chapter we will you will come to know about the respiration, not the mechanism of respiration but only the process of respiration and the process of breathing, how breathing is involved in respiration, mechanism of breathing and the exchange of gases in lungs and in tissues, and also the some respiratory disorders, and you will also have to study a brief regulation of respiration by nervous system. So let's start the chapter. First of all, as we are studying the breathing and exchange of gases, and then the breathing is involved in the inhalation of oxygen. Then what is respiration? Actual respiration is the breakdown of complex molecule into the simpler one to release energy from that particular complex molecule. The simplification of this complex molecule is done by breaking the carbon-carbon bonds, and by breaking this carbon-carbon bond energy is released, and the carbon, it exists in carbon compounds. So respiration, it occurs only in the case of carbonic organic compounds, which may include carbohydrates, which may include any fat, which may include any proteins. Okay, so what are the respiratory organs which are involved in the various kind of respiration? Generally, respiration, it involves the involvement of respiratory organs which may be skin, which may be gills, and which may be lungs. The respiration which occurs through skin or skin as respiratory organ is termed as cutaneous respiration. Cutaneous respiration, it occurs in amphibians, in adult amphibians on terrestrial mode annelids. Okay, when adult amphibian, it undergoes in aquatic life, then skin, it come in action and it respire by its skin. Annelids, they also show the cutaneous respiration. Gills, the respiration through gills is termed as branchial respiration and is a peculiar feature of aquatic organism. All those organisms which are aquatic, they respire through gills. Fishes and most of the arthropods, they are aquatic in nature, and many arthropods, for example prawn, it respire through gills, and all the fishes, they respire through gills. Lungs, all the terrestrial organisms, especially vertebrates, they respire with the help of lungs. Means lungs, they are acting as their respiratory organ and their mode of life is terrestrial. So most of the terrestrial organisms, they respire or they breathe through lungs. So in this respiration is termed as pulmonary respiration. So we have to study the human respiratory system, that what are the organs or parts involved in the human respiratory system. The human respiratory system, it starts from the nose. The opening of nose to atmosphere is termed as external nostril, external layers. The external layers, it lead into the nasal chamber, that is a cavity enclosed by our nose, and the nose, it opens into pharynx by internal layers. So through external nostril, air enter into the nasal chamber and then enter to internal layers, and through internal layers that air is passed through pharynx. Means internal layers, they open into the pharynx. Pharynx, it has three parts. The parts in which our nose have opening is termed as nasopharynx, and the part in which our food in which our buccal cavity having opening, that is termed as oropharynx, and the part in which larynx is present, that is termed as laryngopharynx. Okay. So in pharynx, the larynx is also present, that is termed as laryngopharynx. The part in which larynx or the voice box is present is termed as laryngopharynx. Okay. Now the nasopharynx, it is the uppermost part of the pharynx in which our internal layers or nasal chambers open. The pharynx, it leads into the trachea through an opening that is termed as glottis, and the covering of that glottis is termed as epiglottis. Epiglottis is a membranous flap which covers the windpipe or food pipe both, but it depends on the requirement. The windpipe, it remains always open, but during swallowing of food, epiglottis, it covers the windpipe, that is our trachea. So pharynx, with the help of this epiglottis, opens into trachea. The trachea, it leads into the bronchi. That these part, they are bronchus, singular is bronchus, plural is bronchi. The trachea, the main windpipe, it divides into two bronchus and they are termed as bronchi. The bronchi, they further get divided into a number of alveoli or a number of branches, and the branches of bronchi are termed as bronchioles. The bronchioles, they are having sac-like structures, or the inner membrane of the lungs is folded into this sac-like structure, and these are termed as alveoli. Singular is alveolus and plural is alveoli. Okay. Now the trachea and the bronchus or bronchi, they are having rings on them. These rings, they are formed of cartilage. So these rings are cartilaginous ring, and the hyoid cartilage, it is involved in the formation of these cartilaginous rings. These cartilaginous rings, they maintain the shape of windpipe and the bronchi undisturbed. Okay. The alveoli, they are filled with the intermembranous space, or the space between two membranes of lungs is filled with a field, that is termed as pleural field. Okay. Now breathing. The lungs, they are involved in breathing, means they receive the oxygen and transport it to the tissues, and in the tissues or cells, the oxygen, it is used for the breakdown of food. So what is breathing? Breathing is inhalation of oxygen from atmosphere, okay, and exhalation of CO2 from lungs to atmosphere. Means inhalation of oxygen to lungs and exhalation of carbon dioxide from lungs constitute the breathing. So breathing is simple process which involve inhalation and exhalation of gases, or inhalation or exhalation of air, and that air, oxygen, carbon dioxide are present. So along in inhalation, oxygen is inhaled along with air, and during exhalation, carbon dioxide is exhaled with air. Okay. Then what is the difference between breathing and respiration? Breathing is the first step, basic step involved in respiration. In aerobic respiration, means breathing is the process by which oxygen is carried to the body and finally to the cells or tissues or the cells. But in respiration, the cells, they make use of oxygen for oxidation of food to release the energy from food. Means during respiration, the food is oxidized with the help of oxygen to release the energy from that food, while breathing, it only involves inhalation and exhalation of gases. Okay. Now what is the mechanism of breathing? Mechanism of breathing is in your syllabus. Mechanism of respiration, you have studied it before in the plant respiration. Okay. So mechanism of breathing, what is the, how breathing it is regulated? Our body cavity is divided into two major cavities, okay, by a membranous flap. This membranous flap is diaphragm. The diaphragm, it separates our body cavity into two parts, that is thoracic. In the upper chest region, it is present is thoracic cavity, and in the lower position, it is our abdominal cavity. Okay. Lungs are present in thoracic cavity. In thoracic cavity, lungs and heart are present, while our internal viscera, it is present in abdominal cavity. Okay, so the diaphragm, it contracts. As the diaphragm or the membranous flap, it contracts, it enforces the abdominal cavity, means it exerts a pressure on abdominal cavity, and abdominal cavity is contracted while ribs and sternum, they are having cartilaginous bands, and with the help of these cartilaginous bands, the ribs and sternum, they expand. As the ribs and sternum expand and the diaphragm, it is contracted towards abdominal cavity, the size and the volume of thoracic cavity is increased. As the size or volume of the thoracic cavity is increased, then the pressure of air in cavity is decreased, and it causes pressure difference between the thoracic cavity and atmosphere. The pressure difference between thoracic cavity and atmosphere result in the inhalation, means due to low pressure into thoracic cavity and high pressure of air in atmosphere, the air, it is exerted into lungs, which is termed as inhalation. Okay, means the pressure difference between atmosphere and thoracic cavity causes the inhalation. The thoracic cavity has lower pressure while atmosphere have higher pressure, so air, it always flow from high pressure to lower pressure, so air, it enters the lungs, which causes inhalation. When an inhalation is completed or the thoracic cavity is get completed with air, then the diaphragm, it relaxes or it expands. Okay. So when diaphragm expands, it comes into its original position. Along with this, ribs and sternum, which were expanded to maximum, now they also come to their normal or original position. It results in decreasing the size of thoracic cavity. As the size of thoracic cavity is decreased, the air pressure in thoracic cavity, it becomes increased or high. So air, it always flow from high pressure to low pressure. When pressure in this cavity is increased, then it is much more than the atmospheric pressure. So air, it generally flow from high pressure to low pressure, so it is expelled from the lungs to atmosphere and it causes exhalation. So exhalation, it simply follow the pressure differences between thoracic cavity and atmosphere. When the pressure is lower in thoracic cavity due to contraction of diaphragm, the air, it comes or it enters the lungs, and when pressure is higher in thoracic cavity due to relaxation of diaphragm or decreased size of thoracic cavity, then air, it is expelled to atmosphere and it is termed as exhalation. This is simple mechanism of breathing. Okay. Now how the inhalation and exhalation, they lead to a number of terms which involve a different kind of respiratory volumes or capacities. Respiratory volumes and capacities are the amount of the gases or the amount of air that can be expelled or that can be inhaled by lungs into different conditions. So start with the first volume, that is tidal volume, abbreviated as TV. Tidal volume is the total volume that is inspired or expired by lungs in a particular normal respiration. Means there is no activity, there is no hypersensitivity of respiratory system, only normal respiration or normal breathing rate. So at normal breathing rate, the total volume of air which can be inspired or expired by lungs is termed as total volume. It is approx 500 ml of air in single one breath, and is 6000 to 8000 ml per minute. Then inspiratory reserve volume, means it is also abbreviated as IRV. It is the total volume of air which can be inspired during forcible inspiration, means the maximum of air which can be hold, which can be inspire beyond a normal respiration. Means a normal inspiration during the total volume of air which can be forcibly inspired is termed as inspiratory reserve volume, and it comes to stand about 2500 to 3000 ml per minute. Now expiratory reserved volume, abbreviated as ERV, it is the forcibly expired volume after a normal expiration. Means along with a normal expiration, the maximum volume of air which can be expired forcibly is termed as ERV or expiratory reserved volume. It comes to stand as 1000 to 1100 ml per minute. Now vital capacity, it is the total capacity of air that a person can breathe after a forcible expiration. Means after a maximum expiration, the total volume of air which lungs of a person can hold is termed as his vital capacity. It is a sum total of expiratory reserve volume, tidal volume and inspiratory reserve volume. Means the three volumes we have studied earlier, all these constitute the vital capacity. It is also abbreviated as VC. Now comes the residual volume. Means after a forcible expiration, total volume of air that remained in lungs is termed as residual volume. It comes to stand as 1100 to 1200 ml per minute. Now inspiratory capacity is abbreviated as IC, that is the normal total volume of air which a person can inspire after a normal expiration. Means no forcible inspiration, no forcible expiration, the total volume of air that a person can inspire after a normal expiration, the maximum of the air that can be held up by lungs after a normal expiration, that is termed as tidal volume plus inspiratory reserve volume. Means maximum volume of inspired, so it also include the total volume of air that can be inspired forcibly. Now expiratory capacity is termed as EC. After a normal inspiration, total volume of air that can be expired, it involves the tidal volume that can be expired normally and involve expiratory reserve volume that can be expired forcibly. So expiratory capacity is a sum total of total volume or tidal volume and expiratory reserve volume. Then functional residual volume, abbreviated as FRV, means the total volume of air that remained in lungs after a normal expiration, that is termed as functional residual volume. It involves the expiratory reserve volume, means that is not expired forcibly, that volume and residual volume, they together constitute the functional residual volume. Then total lung capacity means the total volume of air that can be accommodated, that can be held up by lungs after a forced inspiration. When we undergoes a forcibly inspiration, the maximum inspiration, then the total volume of air that can be accommodated by our lungs at the end of that particular forcible inspiration is termed as total lung capacity or TLC. It is the sum total of all the inspiratory volumes and all the reserve volume, expiratory reserve volume and tidal volume. Okay. Now how the gaseous exchange take place, means how the gases are exchanged in the lungs. The gases, they are exchanged on the behalf of the concept of pressure gradient or the pressure difference across a particular semi-permeable membrane, and the mechanism that is followed by this gaseous transport is simple diffusion. Means the gases, they undergoes exchange between blood and the lungs through the lungs alveoli or blood capillaries. Both are thin membrane and and both are semi permeable too, and the gases they simply follow the concept of simple diffusion, means flow of from maximum concentration to lower concentration through a semi permeable membrane. So let us have a look on the exchange of gases. This is the total, this is the blood, okay, heart circulating the blood, the heart through pulmonary vein, the heart it pump the blood into pulmonary artery, and this pulmonary artery it carries the blood to lungs, and lungs is site of gaseous exchange. So in lungs the partial pressure of oxygen is maximum because the concentration of oxygen is much more than carbon dioxide in air that is inhaled. So partial pressure of oxygen will be higher than that of oxygen. So the gas with higher pressure or partial pressure will bind to the hemoglobin. So in lungs the partial pressure of oxygen is higher, the oxygen will bind to the hemoglobin. And then how this exchange take place? The lungs alveoli, it is thin layered, means single layered, and the blood vessels they breaks into blood capillaries in the lungs. So the blood capillaries they are also thin walled or single celled thickness. Okay. So the blood flowing in these capillaries come in contact with the membrane of lungs alveoli. Lungs alveoli are thin membrane, blood capillaries are thin membrane. The blood came from the body tissues, means the deoxygenated blood it is transported to lungs by pulmonary artery, and the pulmonary artery it carries the deoxygenated or the blood with maximum CO2 or higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide in it. So by following the concept of partial pressure, the CO2 present in blood passes to the lungs alveoli, and the oxygen from lungs alveoli passes to the blood capillaries by following the concept of partial pressure through the semi permeable membrane, thin walled semi permeable membrane. Okay. So in lungs partial pressure of oxygen is maximum, so oxygen it flows from lungs alveoli to blood vessel, and in blood vessel or blood capillaries the partial pressure of CO2 is maximum, so it flows from blood vessels to lungs alveoli, and thus the gaseous exchange it is completed. And after exchange the pulmonary vein it carries the blood to heart, and this oxygenated blood is then transported to all the body tissues, and the body tissues they use this oxygen for oxidation of food, and as a result of respiration CO2 is produced, and that CO2 is picked up by blood, and the blood it carries the CO2 by to heart, and from heart with the help of pulmonary arteries is transported to lungs, and from lungs it is expelled out from alveolar cavity by following the same passage as follows by the inhalation of air, means by following this same pathway the CO2 is passed away from the lungs through the respiratory system. Okay. Now after exchange of gases, how these gases are transported to body tissue or from body tissues to the lungs, means how the gases they are transported from body tissues to the lungs, and after exchange how they are transported from lungs to the body tissues. The carbon dioxide is transported from tissue to lungs, while the oxygen it is transported from lungs to tissues. It all is done by a single pigment present in our blood, that is a iron containing pigment, that is hemoglobin. Hemoglobin it is efficient for oxygen as well as carbon dioxide. Hemoglobin efficiency is more for carbon dioxide, but then why it bind to oxygen? The binding it depend on the partial pressure of gases. The gas with maximum partial pressure will bind to hemoglobin, means the binding or the transport of gases, it also follow the concept of partial pressure. In lungs, oxygen, it is having high partial pressure, so its affinity will also be high for the hemoglobin, means hemoglobin will be more efficient for oxygen than CO2, and following this concept, oxygen it bind to the hemoglobin and reaches to the maximum saturated phase, means the maximum hemoglobin it is binded with the oxygen, and when hemoglobin it is bind with the oxygen, then the hemoglobin it is termed as oxyhemoglobin. And this oxyhemoglobin it carries the oxygen from lungs to tissues. Okay, on average per 100 ml of blood, per 100 ml of oxygenated blood can transport 5 ml of oxygen per minute. Okay, so 5 ml of oxygen is transported by 100 ml of blood into single circulation. Now CO2, it now partial pressure of oxygen, it depends on the availability of oxygen. In lungs, the oxygen concentration is maximum, so hemoglobin will be more efficient for the oxygen. Although the binding of oxygen CO2 is also favored by some factors other than the partial pressure, which involves temperature, which involves partial pressure of CO2 as well, and the positive ion concentration or the pH. Higher the pH, lower the CO2 concentration, and higher the amount of oxygen will favor the maximum binding of hemoglobin with oxygen. And in these conditions, if in the normal concentration, in the normal conditions, only the partial pressure it comes in action, but when along with partial pressure these factors also come in action, then in the lower temperature, lower partial pressure of CO2 and high pH, the curve which can be drawn between the percent hemoglobin saturation and partial pressure of oxygen, means the oxygen which is binding to hemoglobin and saturating the hemoglobin, the curve it will shift to the left side, means the maximum saturation of oxygen is done by at lower partial pressure of oxygen, means if the oxygen pressure is lower, then by increasing these particular factors we can make the hemoglobin more efficient for oxygen, and in these conditions the curve it will shift to the left side. But when partial pressure of carbon dioxide is increased, the pH it is also decreased to acidic, then the curve it will shift to the right, means at the higher partial pressure of oxygen the percent saturation will be lower. So the minimum binding of oxygen will take place with hemoglobin, and it result in dissociation of oxygen from hemoglobin, and it is termed as oxygen dissociation curve. It is an important topic and the question they are arise from this topic. So what will the effect of partial pressure of oxygen, what will the effect of partial pressure of carbon dioxide in a normal oxyhemoglobin curve? Okay. Now how CO2 is transported? The CO2 produced as a result of respiration, all the CO2 is not transported to the lungs. Some amount of CO2 it is converted to hydrogen carbonate ion with the help of enzyme carbonic anhydrase, which is present in the tissues as well as blood plasma. So the enzyme is capable of converting the hydrogen carbonate ions to carbon dioxide as well as carbonate ions. So plasmic carbonic anhydrase enzyme it convert the bicarbonate ions to carbonate ions so as to maintain the pH or the ionic balance of the plasma. So in tissues, when CO2 is produced, the partial pressure of CO2 is maximum. So hemoglobin is having maximum affinity. Then how the affinity is increased? The carbonate ions, they are picked up by blood. Okay, the CO2 produced by tissues is picked up by blood. In the blood, the enzyme carbonic anhydrase, it convert it into carbonate ion, and these carbonate ion are picked up by blood and are transported to the lungs. When these carbonate ions reaches the lungs, then they are broken down into carbon dioxide and water by the same enzyme carbonic anhydrase, and it will increase the concentration of carbon dioxide in the lungs. Following the partial pressure concept, the carbon dioxide, it flows from blood to lungs and then finally transported to the atmosphere through the respiratory system. On average, per 100 ml of blood can transport 4 ml of CO2 in a single circulation. Carbon dioxide, it is produced in the form of carbon dioxide, transported in the form of carbonate ion in the plasma, and finally excreted in the form of carbon dioxide by reaching at the lungs site, and its mechanism is catalyzed or controlled by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Now, how respiration is regulated? The oxygen, it is having an insignificant or negligible role in regulation of respiration. The oxygen, only the partial pressure of oxygen affect the binding of oxygen to the hemoglobin. It does not control the mechanism or does not regulate the mechanism of respiration. The respiration mechanism is regulated by our nervous system. The nervous system, it is having various centers for the mechanism of respiration, which involve rhythmic center, pneumotaxic center and chemosensitive area. Okay. The rhythmic center, it is present in the medulla. The rhythmic center, it makes the rhythmic binding and dissociation of oxygen in the lungs as well as in the tissues, so that the maximum oxygen is available to our tissues or the cells to respire. And the pneumotaxic center, it is present in the pons. It recognizes the concentration of some particular ions and the carbon dioxide, and it gives a signal to the medulla, and the medulla, it adjusts its rhythms or our breathing rate so as maximum of the oxygen will be available to our cells, and that particular ions or that particular concentration or chemicals or substances can be removed from our body, and these are received by chemosensitive area, and these chemosensitive area, they are sensitive to higher concentration of CO2 and higher concentration of hydrogen ions, means these are sensitive to higher carbon dioxide concentration and higher acidic pH. Okay. So, the rhythmic center and the pneumotaxic center, they collectively regulate the respiratory rate or the mechanism of respiration. As the concentration of carbon dioxide and the hydrogen ion increased, the pons and chemosensitive area receives that particular signal, and they transport that signal to the medulla, and medulla, it is regulating our breathing rate. So, by increasing or decreasing breathing rate, the medulla, it control our rate of respiration. When our energy requirement is increased due to any of the activity, then our oxygen consumption or oxygen demand is increased, because our cells are respired at a high rate and producing high amount of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ion, and these concentration are received by these particular center, and they give a signal to the medulla, and in the response the medulla, it provide a signal to our respiratory system or the lungs that the breathing rate has to be increased, and we start to breathing faster and faster to release or to neutral that increased concentration. And when this concentration is neutralized, pons and the chemosensitive area, they stop getting that particular signals, and they also stop the impulses that are transported to the medulla, and finally our breathing rate, it comes to a normal position. So our respiratory system, our respiration mechanism is controlled by our nervous system, not the concentration of oxygen. Oxygen, it only by its partial pressure affects the binding or dissociation of hemoglobin with oxygen. Our lifestyle, or the modern lifestyles, also has associated with a number of disorders. So respiratory system also has some disorders which are generally arise due to our lifestyle or malfunctioning of respiratory system, due to basically the most basic reason behind this is pollution that we are generating in our modern lifestyle. So out of which the three respiratory disorders, they are most important and are included in our syllabus. Then the respiratory disorders are those disorders which are generally arise due to malfunctioning of respiratory system. The reason behind it may be any simple allergen, or it may be pollution. The pollution is air pollution. It is the most important reason that is affecting our respiratory system and causing a number of disorders. So out of this, the disorders are generally caused by pollution or generally caused due to our bad habits, that are asthma and emphysema. Asthma is, in asthma, the pollution due to pollutant present in air, the bronchi and bronchioles, they are inflamed. They are firstly they are infected with that particular pollutants, and then they are inflamed. The inflammation, it result in the decreased surface area, and that's why we feel difficulty in breathing. And if this difficulty is increased to a much more extent, then the patient, it generally faces asthma attacks, in which the person or the patient, it gets fainted. If the patient doesn't get treated at the proper time, he or she also can face the coma or even the deaths. Emphysema, it is generally a side effect of smoking, in which the alveolar walls, they are damaged badly, and if the smoking or that particular pollutant that is damaging our alveolar wall is continued, then the alveolar wall is damaged very badly, and the respiratory surface, it is decreased to much more extent that can't be recovered, and it may result into the lungs failure. If the alveolar wall is damaged, then directly the surface required for gaseous exchange is decreased, and the person, he is not capable of respiring properly, and as a result his blood pressure, his breathing rate, they both are increased, and the person, finally, if he continued these habits, then finally his lungs are failed and he faced lung failure. Although some disorders are also caused by the occupation, and due to occupation, the disorder caused are termed as occupational respiratory disorders. This involved two basic, that is fibrosis and silicosis. In the fibrosis, the areolar fibers are damaged. These fibers are generally damaged due to dust particles that are entering the respiratory system, and the dust is the major pollutant arising from the stone breaking and stone grinding industry. So the workers working in these industries, they are more prone to fibrosis, because the regular and continued exposure of that particular persons to dust particles they start the dust particles to deposit in their lungs, and the dust particles, they start to damage the areolar fibers, which are necessary for diffusion or exchange purposes. So for diffusionary purposes, the areolar tissue, that is a loose connective tissue, it is most important for the diffusion purpose, and if the areolar fibers, they are damaged, then the lungs, they are not capable of exchanging the gases, and finally it may result in the lung failure. The workers working in the glass industries are more prone to silicosis, because the glass, it contains silica. and the silica it start to deposit in the lungs of that particular person and causes the same effects, and silicosis it may also result in the lung failure if the person it is exposed regularly to that particular silicon or silica concentration. Okay. So, by this our chapter has been ended up. So, read the chapter carefully, watch the video, take the help of this video and your NCERT book to understand the chapter. If you still face any difficulty, any problem, then feel free to contact me at any time.